With preseason testing just around the corner and the buzz of the new season at full throttle, I wanted to look at the data behind the preseason testing to uncover any insight regarding what we can expect from the 2025 testing sessions. With the Formula One regulations regarding car design remaining basically the same for the third year in a row, I expect the competition to be super tight at the front end. So what kind of improvements will we see the teams make, and what lap times will we see these 2025 cars do? For that, let's look into the testing data from the past couple of years. So first, let's look at the fastest lap times for each testing day across the last couple of testing sessions, ever since the new regulations started back in 2022. So as you can see, there's a general trend line that all three testing sessions follow across the years, where they start off with a higher lap time, and then slowly, once the teams start improving their cars, figuring out what are the different optimization setups, they slowly start getting quicker and quicker over the days. Except for 2024, where there was a slight anomaly, and Ferrari actually posted their fastest time on day 2 instead of day 3. And I believe that might be down to weather effects, tire temperatures, some minor changes in that, because it wasn't too big of a difference. So what I did is I went ahead and swapped those lap times so that we can see a clearer picture of how the trend lines evolve across different days of testing. And this becomes really important and puts everything into context when we include the first race of the season, which happens to be the same location as the testing, so we can kind of compare apples to apples of what the teams did in testing and then how that translated over during qualifying. So I plotted the qualifying times for the fastest qualifying throughout the entire session. Q1, Q2, and Q3 looked at the fastest time and plotted that for each of the years. Usually it happens to be Q3 that's the fastest, but in 2024, again, I think Ferrari had the fastest time in Q2 compared to Q3. But you can kind of see the general trend line. It still sticks with it, but the main differences are how much of a lap time gain that you got over the 3 days, and again in qualifying. So to illustrate that, I did a comparison of the year-over-year lap time differences for each day and for qualifying. And disregarding day 1, you can kind of see that every other day and qualifying for race 1, year over year, there was an increase, but then as the regulations stayed constant, the next year's increase compared to the previous year's increase was definitely lower, and I expect that trend line to continue for 2025 as well. So 2022 was the first year when the regulations came out, the new regulations, and from 2022 to 2023, a lot of the teams learned about how to optimize their car to avoid porpoising and how to have the car to be stable and still extract maximum lap time. So there was a huge chunk of time that they gained. And on day 2 of testing, they gained almost 1.6 seconds, and then day 3, they gained almost 1.4 seconds. But then when it comes to the actual qualifying year over year, they gained more than 0.8 of a second. But the same gains were not seen in the next year, 2024 versus 2023, and you could see it tapered off. Day 2 you had about 1.3 seconds, day 3 was only just about 0.4, and then in the race it was closer to 0.5. And this illustrates that, again, not all of the testing data needs to be taken seriously, and you have to look at it with a grain of salt, because all the teams are trying to sandbag and reserve some of their ultimate pace for qualifying. And sure, there might be some situations where they figure out, once they go back to the base after testing, what the right setup for the car is and how to optimize it best for that particular track, and they gain maybe a couple of tenths, but most of the gaps that you see are going to be different compared to testing versus the actual qualifying, because that's when they go flat out, just because teams are using higher fuel loads or less powerful engine settings to mask some of their speed. And that's why even though on day 3 you can see that they only gained about 0.4 from the previous year, it looks a little less, and that's, I believe, is because they were trying to hide some of their pace, and the actual gains were closer to 0.55 seconds. So what do I expect the lap time gains to be be for this year, I think my predictions are going to be around 4/10 of a second. The teams will definitely make a good step forward and gain some lap time, but it'll definitely be less than what we had the previous years. And that's simply down to the fact that the regulations have stayed the same, and so the avenues for exploitation of the rules and regulations or finding loopholes within the regulations, the number of chances to do that decreases because you've kind of already exploited most of them over the past couple of years. And there's only so much more additional performance you can gain within this set of rules. And as the teams get better and better and the gap starts closing in, you're gonna have less of a improvement compared to last year. And so I think overall you're gonna see something similar where there's a little less improvement. So far we looked at overall outright pace of the entire field, but what about team-specific pace and what improvements that they did throughout the years? So let's look at the 2024 testing versus qualifying laps for each team. As you can see, Red Bull and Ferrari were super close to each other, but then their testing data reveals a little different perspective where Ferrari didn't hide that much of their pace, but Red Bull certainly did, with their testing lap time being about 1.8% off their qualifying time, whereas Ferrari's lap time was 1.3% off of their qualifying lap time. From testing, you might have thought, oh, Ferrari were probably quicker, but Red Bull were actually storing or hiding a little bit of their pace. They were essentially sandbagging. And that's the thing where these numbers, part of that could be the teams actually hiding some of their pace, but part of that could be them finding some sweet spots within their car setup that enables them to optimize for their track and gain more performance. So definitely a combination of both. And then you have Kick Sauber over here, where they basically went faster in testing than in qualifying. So they were just negative gaming over there. It was just hilarious. And then you got Alpine over here at the back where they're dead last and still deciding to sandbag by almost 1.5%. I hope they found that much time in qualifying for race one instead of them like hiding their true pace. I really hope so. Now if we look at 2023, you can kind of see the same trends where some teams are hiding a little bit more of their pace. Again, Alpine, I don't know what they're doing, 2% off. They're just like, oh, we're definitely fast. And they come up to qualifying and they're like, not that fast. But it's definitely funny how some teams try to hide a little bit more of their pace, whereas others don't. But let's go back to 2022 when the rules or when the new regulations just came out. And this is where I feel like you can kind of see across the board every team hiding a lot of their pace. And this is because they know that this is completely new regulations. No one knows where they are in the pecking order. No one wants to reveal their hands. So they're trying to play it super close to their chest and not try to give off any signals or any information regarding their performance to their competitors. Every team has quite a bit of performance within their cars that they're not showing in testing. And in fact, the average difference in qualifying versus testing lap time percentage was about 1.52% in 2022 compared to 0.75% in 2023 and 1.24% in 2024. So clearly in the first year when the new regulations came out, all of the teams were definitely hiding a lot more of their pace. But I did notice that one trend across all 3 years was that the team that looked the most confident in their package and testing seemed to be the one that held back most of their speed. And it makes sense because they don't want to give away too much of their information about what their true pace is. But you can see Red Bull in 24, where the gap between their qualifying time and their testing time was off by about 1.8%. And again, in 2022, when Ferrari were super confident, they had 2.1%. So they were holding quite a bit of their pace back then as well. But then if you switch it over to 2023, you can see that Red Bull were only 0.7% off their quality time in testing. And that's a little surprising because everyone knew they were way up front. But if you look at Christian Horner's interview back in 2023 after testing, he did mention that he was expecting a lot of the teams to catch up to them because they hadn't made that many tweaks to their car. It was more of an evolution of their previous year's car. But then to their surprise, they didn't close up as much and they still had the lead. So that's why they were probably playing a little conservatively during testing and they're trying to get closer to their peak performance because they were scared that the other teams were holding back and were actually much closer to them. So I think that's what might have happened, because if you look at 2024, Red Bull came out swinging with a completely new car, with a new concept, and they were confident in testing that they had a good package. And so again, they had a huge difference between their quality time and their testing time. And you can see that across each year. Whichever team seems to be the most confident, they seem to be holding back more of their lap time in testing compared to what their true pace was in qualifying. Except obviously for Alpine, I don't know what they're doing. But one thing's definitely for sure, we can look at all of the data that we want and make predictions, but none of this is going to matter because this is the beauty of Formula One, that it is a live event, a live sport, and no matter how much data you put behind it, it's going to be super hard to predict what's going to happen next. The best thing we can do is just sit back, relax, watch testing, and then see who comes out on top in the first race in Melbourne and qualifying.